The British High Command in 1775 didn't think they were starting a war. They thought they were performing a simple police action. General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, had a clear directive. March from Boston to the town of Concord, seize a massive hidden stockpile of rebel gunpowder, and arrest the two biggest agitators in the colony, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. The British Redcoats were the most disciplined, feared professional soldiers on the planet. They fully expected the colonists to scatter like frightened birds the moment they saw the sun glinting off a line of British bayonets. But the rebels were far more sophisticated than the Crown realized. They had built an elite intelligence network, a web of spies and couriers that watched every move the British made. On the night of April 18th, when the British began to cross the Charles River, the signal was lit. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. Paul Revere and William Dawes didn't just go for a leisurely ride. They were the catalysts for a revolution. Contrary to the Hollywood movies, Revere didn't gallop down the middle of the street screaming, "The British are coming," in a land where everyone was technically a British subject. That would have been confusing and would have alerted the many loyalists living in the area. Instead, he moved with stealth, knocking on specific doors and whispering a more chilling warning. "The regulars are coming out." This was the code that set the entire countryside on fire. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon at Lexington Green, the British encountered something they didn't expect. 77 local farmers, shopkeepers, and veterans of the French and Indian War, standing in a thin, ragged line. T.C. Werete Minutemen, led by Captain John Parker, who famously told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The standoff was agonizingly tense. A British officer rode forward, screaming, "Disperse, you damned rebels. Lay down your arms." As the Americans began to back away, but notably not dropping their guns, a single, sharp crack of a musket echoed through the morning air. Historians still argue over who pulled the trigger. It may have been a nervous colonist, a British soldier from the ranks, or even a sniper behind a nearby hedge. Regardless of who started it, the British response was a devastating volley of lead. In the smoke and chaos, 8 Americans were killed and 10 more wounded. As the British officers reformed their lines and cheered, they genuinely believed the rebellion had been crushed before breakfast. They had no idea that the shot heard round the world had just summoned a storm that would eventually consume their empire. They began the march toward Concord, unaware they were walking straight into a hornet's nest. While the smoke was still clearing from the massacre at Lexington, the British column, nearly 700 men strong, pressed onward toward Concord. Their boots thudded rhythmically on the dirt road, a sound intended to intimidate any peasant who dared watch from their window. To the British regulars, the morning's skirmish was a minor nuisance. They were the king's own, and they had a job to do. Find the cannons, the wooden carriages, and the barrels of gunpowder hidden by the provincial congress. But as they marched, something eerie was happening in the hills around them. The silence of the countryside was being replaced by the rhythmic tolling of church bells. From every farmhouse and every hidden trail, men were emerging. These weren't just individuals, they were organized companies. News of the blood spilled at Lexington had traveled with the speed of a wildfire. The Minutemen weren't just a myth, they were a reality. They were converging on Concord by the thousands. The search for the secret stash. When the British entered Concord around 7 a.m., they found a town that felt like a ghost city. Most of the women and children had fled into the woods. The British commander, Colonel Smith, stayed in the center of town while sending detachments to search the various farms. One detachment, led by Captain Parsons, headed toward the North Bridge to search the farm of Colonel Barrett. They did find a few things, some wooden carriage wheels, which they burned, and some flour which they dumped into the mill pond. But for the most part, the intelligence had failed them. The colonists had successfully moved most of the heavy artillery days before. Frustrated and tired, the British soldiers began to burn what little they found in the town square. From a distance, the massive gathering of militia on Punkatasset Hill saw the rising smoke. To them, it looked like the British were putting the entire town of Concord to the torch. One of the militia officers, Joseph Osmer, famously shouted to his commander, "Will you let them burn the town down?" The stand at the North Bridge. The decision was made. For the first time in history, American colonists were going to march in military formation against a British line. About 400 Minutemen began their descent toward the North Bridge, which was being guarded by about 90 British soldiers. The British were rattled. They were used to seeing rebels run away. Now, they saw a wall of men moving toward them with fixed bayonets and steady pulses. The British began to retreat across the bridge, attempting to pull up the planks to stop the American advance. The tension was a physical weight in the air. As the Americans reached the edge of the bridge, the British opened fire. This wasn't a warning shot. This was lethal. 2 Americans, Isaac Davis and Abner Hosmer, were killed instantly. In that split second, the rules of the world changed. Major John Boutrick, the American commander, screamed the order that would echo through history. Fire, fellow soldiers. For God's sake, fire. The American volley was devastating. It was the first time British officers were specifically targeted and hit. The invincible redcoats, shocked by the ferocity of the return fire, broke ranks. They didn't just retreat. They ran. They fled back toward the center of Concord, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The bridge was won, the bloody road back. A 16-mile gauntlet if the battle at the bridge was a shock. The march back to Boston was a massacre. Colonel Smith realized he was outnumbered and outpositioned. Around noon, he began the 16-mile retreat. He expected a traditional battle, 2 armies facing each other in a field. Instead, he entered a 16-mile-long death trap. The Americans had realized they didn't need to stand in a line to win. They used the terrain. Every stone wall, every massive oak tree, and every barn became a sniper's nest. As the British column moved down the narrow road, they were hammered from both sides. This became known as the Battle Road. At a place called Miriam's Corner, the militia poured fire into the British flank. At the bloody angle, the road made a sharp turn through a wooded area, allowing the Americans to ambush the British from the front and the side simultaneously. The British were exhausted. They had been awake for over 24 hours. They had marched nearly 40 miles, and they were running out of ammunition. Their pride was gone. Soldiers began to throw away their heavy packs, just so they could run faster. Officers were losing control. Some British soldiers, driven to madness by the invisible enemy, began to storm into farmhouses along the road, killing anyone inside and setting the buildings on fire in a desperate attempt to stop the sniping. The rescue and the realization, just as the British column was about to collapse and surrender, they saw a sight that saved them. A massive relief force of 1,000 men and 2 cannons, led by Lord Percy. They met at Lexington, the very spot where the morning's blood had been spilled. 6 years. That is how long the American colonies had been bleeding by the time 1781 rolled. For your audience to understand the stakes of Yorktown, they have to understand that by this point, the revolution was dying. The initial high of Lexington and Concord had vanished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of a global war. George Washington's Continental Army was no longer the spirited group of farmers from 1775. They were tired, they were hungry, and quite frankly, they were on the verge of total collapse. Imagine being a soldier in Washington's camp. You haven't been paid in months, your shoes are literally falling apart, and you're re-watching your friends desert the cause because they need to go home and plant crops so their families do UN starve. This wasn't a glorious movie montage, it was a test of human endurance. The British High Command in London was also frustrated. They had failed to crush the rebellion in the north. New England was a lost cause, and New York was a stalemate. So, they cooked up a new plan. The Southern Strategy. The British believed that the southern colonies, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia were filled with loyalists, colonists, still loyal to the king. They thought if they could capture the South, they could squeeze the rebellion from the bottom up. They sent their most aggressive general, Lord Charles Cornwallis, to get the job done. Cornwallis was a bulldog. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to destroy. He marched through the Carolinas, winning battles, but losing men he couldn't replace. He was chasing a ghost. Every time he thought he had the American army cornered, they would slip away into the swamps or over the mountains. This cat-and-mouse game exhausted the British. Finally, Cornwallis decided he needed a deep water port to rest his men and get fresh supplies from the British Navy. He chose a small tobacco port in Virginia called Yorktown. On paper, Yorktown was a brilliant choice. It sat on a peninsula, surrounded on three sides by water. In Cornwallis's mind, the British Navy was the undisputed master of the seas. If he got into trouble, the massive British warships would just sail in, drop off cannons and food, and pick him up if needed. But Cornwallis made one fatal assumption. He assumed the French wouldn't show up. While Cornwallis was digging trenches in Yorktown, George Washington was up north in New Jersey, staring at New York City. He was obsessed with taking back New York. But then, a message arrived that changed everything. The French Admiral de Grasse was sailing a massive fleet toward the Chesapeake Banat. New York Washington had a split. Second, to make a choice. He could stay and fight a losing battle in New York, or he could take a massive gamble. He chose the gamble. He decided to march his entire army thousands of men over 400 miles south to trap Cornwallis. Now, this is the untold part of the story that makes for great TV. How do you move an entire army 400 miles without the British in New York noticing? You lie. Washington set up fake camps. He had his men build massive bread ovens and brick structures in New Jersey to make it look like they were preparing for a long siege of New York. He even leaked fake documents that proved his plan was to attack Manhattan. He was so convincing that the British commander in New York, Sir Henry Clinton, stayed behind his walls, waiting for an attack that was never coming. By the time the British realized Washington's army was gone, the Americans were already halfway to Virginia. It was one of the greatest military deceptions in history. We often think of the American Revolution as a DIY war, but without the French, Yorktown would have been a disaster. The French didn't just bring soldiers. They brought a professional army and, more importantly, a navy. For years, the Americans had been begging the French for help. Finally, the French King Louis XVI decided to go all in. Why? Not because he loved democracy, he was a king, after all, but because he hated the British. He saw an opportunity to humiliate his greatest rival. As Washington marched south, the French fleet was already moving into position. This leads us to the Battle of the Capes. It wasn't fought on land, it was fought at sea. The French fleet met the British fleet just outside the Chesapeake Bay, in a brutal exchange of cannon fire. The French did something almost no one else had done in a century. They forced the British Navy to retreat. When Cornwallis looked out from the cliffs of Yorktown in early September 1781, his heart must have dropped. He didn't see the British flags on the horizon. He saw the white and gold flags of the French Navy. He was trapped. Behind him was the sea, controlled by the French. In front of him, the combined American and French armies were arriving, digging their own trenches and pointing hundreds of cannons at his camp. The southern strategy had turned into a southern trap. The man who was supposed to end the rebellion was now the one fighting for his life. The stage was set for the final showdown. The world was about to watch a superpower fall, not because they weren't strong enough, but because they were outsmarted, outmarched, and finally, out. The year is 1781. The American Revolution has been raging for 6 long years. The fate of a nation hangs in the balance, and it's all about to come down to one final, decisive battle on the coast of Virginia. This is the story of the Siege of Yorktown, the masterstroke that won America its independence. Bilate Sumir, British General Lord Cornwallis, had established a base at Yorktown, Virginia. He thought he was in a secure position, able to be resupplied by the Royal Navy. What he didn't count on was the combined might of the American Continental Army, led by George Washington, and their French allies, led by the Comte, and he certainly didn't expect the French Navy, under Admiral de Grasse, to sail up from the Caribbean and blockade the Chesapeake Bay. Suddenly, Cornwallis wasn't in a secure base. He was in a trap. In late September, the combined Franco-American army, numbering around 17,000 men, marched south and completely surrounded Cornwallis's 8,000-man army at Yorktown. Washington knew a direct assault would be suicidal. The British were dug in behind a series of earthen defenses called redoubts. So, he opted for a classic, methodical, and deadly strategy. A siege. The first step was to dig. On the night of October 6th, under the cover of darkness and a thunderstorm, the Allied soldiers began digging a massive trench, what's known as the First Parallel. This trench was over 2 miles long and brought them within artillery range of the British lines. It was back-breaking work, done with shovels and pickaxes, with the constant threat of British cannon fire. But by morning, they had a well-established trench, shocking the British with their speed and efficiency. With the first parallel complete, the real show began. On October 9th, the Allied artillery opened up. Cannons, howitzers, and mortar began a relentless, round-the-clock bombardment of the British positions. Imagine the sound of constant, deafening roar of cannon fire, the whistle of shells, and the explosion of red-hot cannonballs, setting buildings in Yorktown ablaze. The sky was lit up day and night. British soldiers huddled in their fortifications as the earth shook around them. The bombardment was so intense that it systematically destroyed British cannons and morale. But Washington wanted to get closer. He needed to tighten the noose. So, on the night of October 11th, the troops began digging a second parallel trench, T-Swan, whoosed 400 yards from the British main line. This was extremely dangerous work, well within range of British muskets. Progress on this new trench was stalled by two specific British defenses, Redoubt No. 9 and Redoubt No. 10. These were small, self-contained forts, jutting out from the main British line, armed with cannons and infantry, and they had a clear line of fire on the men digging the new trench. They had to be taken. Washington planned a surprise nighttime assault for October 14th. The French were assigned to attack Redoubt, while the Americans were tasked with taking Redoubt 10. Leading the American charge was a young, ambitious officer you might have heard of, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton had been desperate for a field command throughout the war, a chance to prove his valor. This was it. To ensure a surprise, the plan was to advance with bayonets fixed and muskets unloaded. This was a high-risk, high-reward tactic. Firing would give away their position. The attack had to be swift and silent. As darkness fell, Hamilton and his 400 men moved out. They cut through the sharp wooden obstacles in front of the redoubt and swarmed over the earthen walls. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand in the dark, but in less than 10 minutes, it was over. Hamilton and his men had captured Redoubt 10. Simultaneously, the French forces successfully stormed Redoubt 9. The last major British outposts had fallen with the capture of the redoubts. The Allied army could complete their second parallel trench. They moved their heavy artillery into the newly captured positions. Now, the cannons were practically on top of the British, firing down into their main lines from 3 different directions. The situation for Cornwallis was hopeless. His defenses were crumbling. His soldiers were exhausted, and there was no hope of rescue from the sea. The French Navy had complete control of the Chesapeake. Cornwallis made one last, desperate attempt to escape. On the night of October 16th, he tried to ferry his troops across the York River to Gloucester Point, hoping to break through the thin line of Allied forces there and march north to New York. But a violent storm blew in, scattering his boats and ending any chance of escape. The trap was sealed. The next morning, October 17th, a lone British drummer appeared on the parapet, beating the signal for a parley. A British officer followed, waving a white handkerchief. The bombardment, which had been raging for over a week, finally fell silent. Cornwallis requested a ceasefire to negotiate terms of surrender. 2 days later, on October 19th, 1781, the surrender ceremony took place. Thousands of American and French soldiers lined the road to Hampton, watching as the defeated British army marched out of Yorktown. In a final act of defiance, Cornwallis claimed to be ill and sent his second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, to surrender his sword. O'Hara first tried to surrender to the French commander Rochambeau, but Rochambeau directed him to Washington. Washington, in turn, recognizing the slight of Cornwallis not appearing himself, directed O'Hara to his own second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln. It was a symbolic moment. The world had been turned upside down. The news of Yorktown electrified America and stunned London. When the British Prime Minister, Lord North, heard the news, he reportedly exclaimed, "Oh God, it is all over." And he was right. While the war didn't officially end for another 2 years with the Treaty of Paris, the fighting was effectively finished. The victory at Yorktown broke the will of the British to continue the war. It secured American independence and proved that a determined group of rebels, with crucial help from their allies, could defeat the most powerful empire on Earth. The siege, a masterful combination of engineering, artillery, and raw courage, was the final act in the drama of the American Revolution. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most pivotal moments in world history, the American Revolution. But how did it all start? What pushed a group of British colonies to declare independence and take on the mightiest empire on Earth? It wasn't a single event, but a slow burn, a series of sparks that eventually ignited a massive fire. Let's rewind the clock and uncover the real story behind the birth of a nation. To understand the revolution, we first need to go back to 1763. This was a huge year. The 7 Years' War, which you might know as the French and Indian War in North America, had just ended. Britain won, and it was a massive victory. France was kicked out of North America, and British territory expanded dramatically. On the surface, things looked great for the British Empire and its American colonists. They had fought side by side, and now they had a vast, secure continent to themselves. People in London and Boston alike celebrated the victory. It felt like the dawn of a new era of prosperity and partnership. But, as we'll see, this victory planted the seeds of its own destruction. Winning a global war is incredibly expensive. Britain's national debt had ballooned, nearly doubling. The British government looked at its vast new territories in America and thought, well, we need to defend this land, and that costs money. Who should help pay for it? Their eyes turned to the American colonists. From London's perspective, this was only fair. The war had been fought partly to protect the colonies from the French and their Native American allies. Now, with a permanent army needed in North America to manage the new territories and keep the peace, it seemed logical that the colonists should contribute to their own defense. This one simple idea that the colonies should pay up would fundamentally change the relationship between Britain and America forever. The first major move was the Proclamation of 1763. King George III drew a line along the Appalachian Mountains and told the colonists they could unsettle west of it. For the British, this was a practical measure to prevent costly wars with Native American tribes, like Pontiac's Rebellion, which was happening at the time. But for the American colonists, it felt like a slap in the face. Many had fought in the war specifically to gain access to that western land. Land meant opportunity, wealth, and a future for their families. Now, the king was telling them, no, that's not for you. It felt like a betrayal. They saw a vast, empty continent and were being penned in along the coast. This was the first time many colonists felt that London's interests were not the same as their own. Then came the taxes. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. Now, there had been a tax on molasses before, but it was rarely enforced. The Sugar Act actually lowered the tax, but came with a catch. The British were now going to seriously enforce it. This meant more customs officials, more paperwork, and a crackdown on smuggling, which was a very lucrative business in the colonies. For the colonists, this wasn't just about the money. It was about the change in policy. Before, they felt they had a degree of economic freedom. Now, it felt like Big Brother was watching over their shoulders. But the real firestorm erupted in 1765 with the Stamp Act. This was different. It wasn't a tax on imported goods. It was a direct tax on the colonists themselves. Nearly every piece of paper had to have a special stamp on it, showing the tax had been paid. We're talking newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, you name it. This was the first time Parliament had imposed a direct tax like this on the colonists, and the reaction was explosive. Why? Because it hit everyone, from lawyers and merchants in the cities to farmers in the countryside. And it raised a fundamental constitutional question. Could Parliament tax the colonists when they had no elected representatives in that Parliament? The cry of no taxation without representation echoed across the 13 colonies. This became the rallying cry of the entire movement. Patrick Henry gave his fiery speeches in the Virginia House of Burgesses. In Boston, a group called the Sons of Liberty formed, led by figures like Samuel Adams. They organized protests, sometimes violent ones, intimidating the stamp distributors until they all resigned. A Stamp Act, Congress was called, where representatives from 9 colonies came together to formally protest. This was a huge step. For the first time, the colonies were acting together, united against a common enemy. Faced with this unified and, frankly, chaotic resistance, and with British merchants complaining that the colonial boycotts were hurting their business, Parliament backed down. In 1766, they repealed the Stamp Act. The colonists celebrated. It seemed like they had won. They had stood up to the mighty British Empire and made them blink. But here's the crucial part. On the very same day they repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act. This act stated that Parliament had the right to make laws for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. Essentially, London was saying, "Okay, we'll take back this one tax, but don't get it twisted. We are still in charge. We have total authority over you." Most colonists were so happy about the Stamp Act repeal that they didn't pay much attention to the Declaratory Act, but it was a constitutional time bomb, just waiting to go off. And it didn't take long. In 1767, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, came up with a new plan. He figured if the colonists hated direct taxes, he'd tax them indirectly. The Townshend Acts placed new duties on imported goods like glass, lead, paint, paper, and, most famously, tea. From London's point of view, this was perfectly legitimate. It was an external tax, a trade regulation, not a direct internal tax like the stamp tax. But the colonists didn't buy it. They saw it for what it was. Another attempt to raise money from them without their consent. The argument, a tax is a tax, started to gain ground. The boycotts started up again. Tensions simmered, particularly in Boston, which was the epicenter of colonial resistance. To enforce the new taxes and clamp down on dissent, Britain sent troops to Boston in 1768. Having a standing army in your city during peacetime was a major red flag for anyone who valued English liberty. It felt like an occupation. Soldiers and civilians were crammed together, competing for jobs and living in a constant state of friction. You can just imagine the atmosphere. Insults being hurled, street brawls, constant tension. It was a powder keg, and on March 5th, 1770, that powder keg exploded. A confrontation between a crowd of Bostonians and a squad of British soldiers ended in bloodshed. The soldiers, feeling threatened and cornered, fired into the crowd, killing 5 colonists, including Crispus Attucks. The Sons of Liberty immediately branded it the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere created a powerful engraving that showed the British soldiers firing mercilessly on an unarmed, innocent crowd. It was brilliant propaganda. It spread throughout the colonies, painting the British as brutal tyrants. The reality was more complicated, of course, but the image stuck. The Boston Massacre became a symbol of British oppression. After the massacre, there was a period of relative calm. Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties, except for one, the tax on tea. They kept the tea tax as a symbol, a way of reminding the colonists of the Declaratory Act, that they still had the right to tax them. For a few years, things quieted down, but the underlying issues hadn't gone away. The committees of correspondence, organized by people like Sam Adams, kept the spirit of resistance alive, writing letters and pamphlets to share news and coordinate strategy among the colonies. They were building a network, a political infrastructure for a revolution. The final straw came in 1773 with the Tea Act. This one is often misunderstood. The act wasn't designed to raise taxes. It was designed to save the struggling British East India Company. It actually made the company's tea cheaper in the colonies, even with the tax, than smuggled Dutch tea. But the colonists saw through it. It was a clever trick to get them to accept the principle of the tea tax. It was a move to create a monopoly for a British company and to prove, once and for all, that Parliament could tax them. To the Patriots, it was a test of their principles, and they didn't fail the test. In cities like Charleston and New York, colonists refused to let the tea be unloaded. But in Boston, the royal governor was determined to land the tea and collect the tax. So, on the night of December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty took matters into their own hands. Dressed as Native Americans, they boarded the 3 tea ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. This event, the Boston Tea Party, was a direct act of defiance. It was a destruction of private property worth a fortune. There was no going back now. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached London, the British government was furious. They saw it as anarchy, as a direct challenge to their authority that could not be ignored. Their response was swift and harsh. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws that the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed until the city paid for the tea. The Massachusetts government was put under direct royal control. British officials accused of crimes could be sent to Britain for trial, and a new quartering act allowed governors to house soldiers in private homes. These acts were designed to punish Massachusetts and isolate it from the other colonies, but they had the exact opposite effect. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts united the colonies. They saw the fate of Massachusetts as a preview of what could happen to any of them. If Parliament could do this to one colony, it could do it to all of them. The other colonies rallied to Boston's aid, sending supplies and messages of support. And in September 1774, 12 of the 13 colonies all, except Georgia, sent delegates to Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. This was no longer just about taxes. It was about fundamental rights and self-governance. The delegates endorsed a boycott of British goods and began to organize militia. They were preparing for the worst. The spark finally met the powder in April 1775. The British commander in Boston, General Gage, got word that colonial militias were stockpiling weapons in the town of Concord. He sent a force of redcoats to seize the weapons and arrest Patriot leaders like Samuel Adams and John Hancock. But the Patriots were watching. Riders like Paul Revere and William Dawes rode through the night to warn the countryside. The regulars are coming. When the British troops reached the town of Lexington, they were met by a small band of colonial militiamen on the village green. A shot rang out, the shot heard round the world. No one knows who fired it, but it started the American Revolution. The fighting continued at Concord and all along the road back to Boston as thousands of militiamen swarmed the British troops. The war had begun. So, from a shared victory in 1763 to open warfare in 1775, it was a dramatic 12-year journey. It was a story of debt, taxes, and territory. But more than that, it was a story of ideas, a clash between two different visions of empire and liberty. On one side, a British Parliament that believed in its supreme authority. On the other, American colonists who believed they possessed fundamental rights that no government could take away. It was a slow, painful breakup that ultimately gave birth to the United States of America. Thanks for watching. I hope this gives you a clearer picture of how the American Revolution really began. It's a complex and fascinating story. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into history. See you next time.